All right, so there's a very fundamental concept within Minoma Analytics called P1 and P2, and you will see that many of the statistics, if not, the most important ones, are built upon this concept of P1 and P2. So it's very important to understand what this is. It is not that difficult, but still very important to cover. So let's cover it. The basic premise is that there are two pivots during any time frame. You have the highest price point and the lowest price point. So that could be, in case of the daily time frame, the daily high and the daily low. In case of the weekly time frame, that can be the weekly high and the weekly low, and so on. And there's an order to when these price points are put in, right? Either the high gets put in first or the low gets put in first. So either the high gets put in first, which means the low gets put in second, and the low gets put in first, which means the high gets put in second. Whichever extreme gets put in first is P1, and whichever came second is P2. And P1 stands for pivot 1, and P2 stands for pivot 2. So in this case, for example, we're going to look at examples, but if the daily low gets put in first and the daily high gets put in after the daily low, that means the daily low is P1 and the daily high is P2. So for this, we use the concept of P1 and P2. As already alluded to. Now, what we're going to look at now is look at some real-time examples, some important takeaways that we want to keep in mind. But it's also important to note that at this point in time, we're not going to look at, what can we do with this or how are we going to use this to our favor. We're just going to look at what is P1 and what is P2. Very important to understand. And then in future videos that you're going to watch, you will find out how we're using these concepts to actually determine the probability of a determined direction. But the main thing for now, to give you a teaser, is that we're going to use these pivots to determine the likelihood of these pivots holding. And you might wonder to yourself, why do we not just use the daily high and the daily low? And why do we do P1 and P2? The gist of it is that it's more actionable, and you will find out why that is later on. But let's go to an example. So we have the day here, our imaginary time frame of the daily open and the daily close. And what you can see here is the daily low, P1, and the daily high, P2. Now, why is this? Is because the daily low got put in first at the start of the day, and the daily high got put in after the daily low at the end of the day. Now, if this was reversed, then the daily low would be P2. But in this case, the daily low got put in first, and the daily high got put in second. Let's look at some more examples. So here you have P1 at the start of the day, or not at the start of the day, but was put in first. The daily low was put in first and the daily high was put in after. Therefore, the daily low is P1 and the daily high is P2. And here's an example where P1 is the high because the daily high got put in first and the daily low got put in second. Hence, P2 is the daily low. So the main concept is really simple, right? It's just, and by the way, this also works for another time frame. So you can also take the weekly time frame, then you have the weekly high and the weekly low, and that's actually what we do in Minoma Analytics. But for the sake of simplicity, I would just be explaining the daily time frame. Just understand that this works on other time frames as well, right? You can just apply this to other time frames. All right, moving on, because this concept is very simple. What we can do is do this automatically or mark this out automatically. So let's do that first. So we just remove this. We have a indicator in Minoma Analytics that will make this easier. And if you want to find this indicator, you have to go to the Discord, and you will see the important links channel. And there you will see a link to the indicator, and what you can do with and it's important, if you open the indicator page, scroll down until you see add to favorites. And the indicator maps this out for us, right? So we can see here that P1 is at hour 0 and P2 is at hour 3. So we're looking at the daily time frame. So it also shows you which hour of the day is putting in the pivot. Why this is important, you will find out later on. But for now, it's just important to realize that this marks out the pivots for you, right? You see the daily open here and the daily close here. This works on other time frames as well. For example, so I go to the 4-hour time frame. You see here that the P1 is on Monday and the P2 is on Tuesday. So in this case is what I'm talking about. This is the weekly open and the weekly close. This is the weekly time frame, right? So now we're looking at, okay, which day of the week is P1 and P2 put in. And there are other time frames as well. If we go to the 30 minutes, we see the 8-hour P1 and P2. Don't worry about this too much yet. This will all make sense. We have the 4-hour P1 and P2, and we even have the 1-hour P1 and P2 that are all mapped out depending on what time frame you choose. So just a little hint on that. You can go to the settings and you can choose which hours or which time frames you want certain time frames. So which time frames you want the P1s and P2s for certain time frames to show up. So in this case, I will see the weekly time frame on the 4-hour to the 1 day, and only on the 1 hour will I see the daily time frame. But you can obviously choose to change that. So here, P1, P2. All right, with that out of the way, now I want to focus on another important concept, which is the P1, P2 flip. For this, you have to understand something. You have to understand that P1 can either stay P1 or it can get taken out, right? And if it gets taken out, it's no longer pivot, because remember, we're looking at the extreme point, the lowest point and the highest point. If we take out P1, it's no longer the lowest point. So therefore it's no longer pivot. Then this would become the pivot. But something happens then, right? Something happens. What happens is that this is no longer a P2, because this is now the first pivot of the day. So if we take out P1, what happens is that P2 is no longer P2 but P1. It is still the highest point of the day, that didn't change. But because now we took it out, we took the low, or we put in the low after we put in the high, this becomes P1 and this would become P2, right? P2, P1. This is something that we call the P1, P2 flip. Something that we call the P1, P2 flip. And it's an important concept that we also use throughout Minoma Analytics. So it is important to understand. This also works on any time frame. But it's very important to understand this concept. Now, another takeaway of this, and we're going to dive into it a little bit more, but P1 can only be P1 or get taken out, right? So P1 can never become P2 because you're never going to be able to take any higher or low that will make this the second pivot of the day, right? It's just not going to happen. It was put in first. But P2 can either stay P2 or become P1 by taking out P1, so the P1, P2 flip, or it can get taken out as well, and then we just have a new P2, right? Now, let's look a little bit more as an example here. Here we go. So here we had the old P1, and here we had the old P2. So in this case, you have to imagine that we are somewhere here in this price action. In that case, P1 was here and P2 was there. Now what happens is that we took out P1, right? So the P1, P2 flip happens when you take out P1. It's important to understand. So if we take out P1 right there, then what happens is that this is no longer a pivot, right? So it was the old P1, but it's no longer the highest point of the day because we just took it out. This was P2, but because now the daily low is put in first and the daily high is put in second, this became P1, and now this is P2. If you're wondering, okay, but how are we going to use this? Don't worry about it yet. It will all make sense in later videos. For now, really just focus on understanding the concept of P1 and P2 and the P1, P2 flip. Let's see, here we have another example where we have first the P1 here and the P2 there. Then we see that P1 is taken out by a new lower low right there. And what happens is that this P2 now is P1 because the high, it's still the daily high, but it now was put in before the daily low. And as such, this is the new P1. And here we put in the new P2. So this is very important to understand. In the written tutorials, there is a cheat sheet for this. So we can simply see, very simply, P1, P2, P1, P2. And here we see a cheat sheet for the P1, P2 flip, right? What happens if we have to flip from high to low or from low to high. So here P1 is the high, P2 is the low. then it gets taken out, the high gets taken out, and the low becomes P1. And here vice versa. So you can find this in the written tutorials in case you ever want to see it. But this is the basic premise of the P1, P2 flip. So I wanna emphasize once again, and now we're gonna see live what happens here. What's gonna happen is that we take out P2, and that will give us a new P2, right? But P1 will stay P1, and we'll just get a new P2. Now, something I wanna emphasize is once again that P1 can either stay P1 or get taken out, and P2 can either stay P2, can become P1 or get taken out, right? So P2, the P2 always has one more option. Again, in case you're wondering, what am I gonna do with this? We're gonna dive into that. Let's see if we can find one example of a P1, P2 flip. Yes, yesterday already. So you can actually, look back with this setting if you want to do some back testing. So what we saw here yesterday, and then you see it in action, is that we had P1 as the daily high and P2 as the daily low. And there you go, we took out this old P2, so P1 is still the daily high and P2 is still the daily low. New P2 again, and then what happened is that we started grinding up. So the daily high is P1, the daily low is P2. Watch what happens if we take out the daily high. Bam, right? P1, P2. So this is no longer a pivot. This was P2, but because now it's put in before the daily low, and this is put in after the daily low, right? So it's the daily high is put in second. Now the daily low became P1, and the daily high became P2. So let's look at that flip one more time. Daily P1 as the daily high, daily P2 as the daily low. Take it out, bam, daily low as P1 and daily high as P2. So that's pretty much all you need to know about the concept of P1 and P2. Once again, it will become more clear what we are going to do with it, but just to recap, P1 and P2 are the high and low for a given time frame. If the high was put in before the low is P1 and the low P2. If the low is put in before the low is P1 and the high P2. P1 can never become P2, as explained, but P2 can become P1, which is the P1, P2 flip we have been talking about. The reason we are using P1 and P2 instead of just the daily high and the daily low is because the concept of P1 and P2 are more actionable, right? So you could also just say, well, why are we not just using here the daily high and or the daily low and the daily high and use statistics on that? Well, the reason, as you will see, is that P1 and P2 is more actionable, and therefore this is what we use. So this concludes our video, the tutorial about P1 and P2. Now you are armed with some fundamental concepts, and with this knowledge you can move on to the next video. So looking forward to see you there.